January 17th, 1847, Dublin. The Irish Poor Law Commission records something that shouldn't exist. In County Cork, where potato blight has blackened every field for 18 months, a Quaker relief worker named William Forster documents 7 families still eating from winter gardens. Not stored food, fresh food, in January. The temperature that week averaged 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost recorded on 14 consecutive mornings. By every agricultural model taught in European farming manuals of the period, those gardens should have been bare dirt. The Commission's report uses the word inexplicable twice. What those families planted shouldn't have survived. The timing violated what agronomists considered biological law. But the harvests were real, measured. Photographed by early daguerreotype. The Royal Horticultural Society requested cuttings. So what grew in frozen ground while 1 million people starved 20 miles away? Stay with me, because the next detail changes how this story works. Modern agricultural extension officers, USDA, RHS, Agriculture Canada, publish the same guidance every December. January is not a planting month. They recommend ordering seeds, planning, waiting for spring. Yet 17 specific crops, when planted in January under documented methods, produce more total calories per square foot annually than any spring-summer garden cycle. This isn't theory. It's yield data spanning 4 centuries, 3 continents, and conditions ranging from highland Guatemala to Norwegian fishing villages. The contradiction isn't that these crops survive winter, it's that removing them from our planting calendars created the food dependency we now call normal. Stay with me. What you're about to hear could change how you understand survival. In March 2025, the USDA reported the average American family of 4 spends $973 monthly on groceries, up 47% since 2020. That's $11,676 annually, for food that, on average, travels 1,500 miles before reaching your plate. Here's the fragility point. That system depends on diesel fuel, refrigerated transport, and just-in-time logistics with no redundancy. A fuel disruption lasting 10 days empties produce sections. We've seen it. Texas, February 2021. British Columbia floods, November 2021. Each time, the supply chain recovered, barely, because the disruption stayed regional. But the dependency is structural. Households stockpile comfort calories, pasta, rice, canned goods. These prevent hunger for weeks. They don't provide the micronutrients that prevent deficiency diseases. Scurvy symptoms appear in 8 to 12 weeks without vitamin C. Pellagra, niacin deficiency, within 60 days. Beriberi, from thiamine deficit, causes heart failure in adults and kills infants within 90 days. The British Raj documented this during the Bengal famine of 1943. Grain was available. People had rice. 3 million died anyway. Not from starvation, but from micronutrient collapse after months eating nothing but polished grain. Fresh food isn't luxury. It's a biological clock. Now, layer in fertilizer dependency. Modern vegetable yields require nitrogen inputs averaging 150 pounds per acre. That nitrogen comes from the Haber-Bosch process, natural gas converted to ammonia at industrial scale. When natural gas prices spiked 300% in 2022, fertilizer became unaffordable for small farms across East Africa and South Asia. Vegetable production dropped 40% in Kenya. Maize yields fell 60% in Malawi. Those markets didn't recover. They switched to importing. Which brings us to the core problem. Most survival gardening advice assumes you have 6 months. That spring will come. That you can wait until April, plant tomatoes and beans, and harvest in July. But if January is the crisis month, if the disruption happens now, in deep winter, that advice is useless. What those Irish families understood in 1847 is that winter isn't dormancy, it's selection pressure. The crops that grow in January aren't just cold hardy, they're the ones that continued feeding people when everything else failed. And most of us have never heard their names. The system has a name, though it was never formalized into a single doctrine: overwinter succession planting. It appears in scattered records across 4 continents, always in populations facing chronic food insecurity. The Welsh called it Gard Gaeaf, winter garden. In Brittany, Jardin de Hiver. The Iroquois practiced a version using cold season brassicas and alliums that matured between January and March, time to bridge the hunger gap between stored autumn harvests and spring foraging. Here's how it worked. In October or November, while soil temperature still registered above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, families planted specific cold germinating crops. Not all vegetables tolerate this. Most seeds need 60 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, but 17 species, through either natural adaptation or centuries of selection, germinate in cold soil, grow slowly through winter using low angle sunlight, and produce harvest between January and April. These weren't greenhouse crops. No artificial heat. The method relied on 3 mechanisms. First, cold stratification. Seeds of plants like corn salad, Valerianella locusta, and winter purslane, Claytonia perfoliata, actually require cold exposure to break dormancy. Planting them in January, in frozen ground, mimics this natural process. They germinate during brief thaw windows, establish root systems below the frost line, and wait. Second, antifreeze proteins. Crops like winter spinach, Spinacia oleracea, cold hardy varieties, and certain kales, Brassica oleracea variety. Acafola produce proteins that prevent ice crystal formation inside cell walls. This allows them to survive tissue temperatures down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit without cell rupture. When air temperature rises above freezing, even for a few hours, they resume photosynthesis. Third, low light photosynthesis. January in northern latitudes delivers roughly 40% of summer's light intensity. Most warm season crops shut down, but species like Claytonia and mash evolved in forest understories. They achieve net calorie production at light levels that would starve a tomato plant. The planting calendar looks like this. Early January, New Year to 15th. Direct sow mash, Claytonia, winter purslane, corn salad, landcress, broad beans, in milder zones, and overwintered spinach. Mid-January, 15th to 31st. Plant garlic cloves, for scapes in April, bunching onions, hardy scallions, and begin forcing rhubarb crowns. By March, these gardens produced leafy greens, vitamin C, folate, iron, alliums, sulfur compounds, prebiotic fiber, legumes, broad beans, protein, lysine, roots, early carrots, overwintered parsnips, calories, stored sugars, a 20-foot by 20-foot plot, 400 square feet, managed under this system could yield 150 to 200 pounds of fresh food between January and May. That's roughly 50,000 to 70,000 calories, plus the micronutrients that prevent deficiency diseases. It wasn't subsistence, it was insurance. Winter, 1916 to 1917, Germany. The British naval blockade has been in effect for 2 years. Grain imports have stopped. Potato harvest failed in 1916 due to late blight. By January, German civilians are receiving 1,000 calories per day, half the survival minimum. Historians call it the Steckrüben winter, the turnip winter. But not everyone starved equally. In Hamburg, municipal records show that households with Schrebergarten, small allotment gardens, had mortality rates 30% lower than apartment dwellers. Those gardens weren't growing turnips in January. They were harvesting winter cresser, Barbaria vulgaris, landcress, posteline, Claytonia perfoliata, and Gruncol, Brassica oleracea var. Sabellica, a cold-hardy kale variety that sweetens after frost. The Hamburg Public Health Office documented this. Dr. Wilhelm Unrein, director of the Municipal Nutrition Program, published a report in April 1917 titled Wintergemüse als Notnahrung, Winter Vegetables as Emergency Food. He noted that families eating fresh greens through January showed lower rates of scurvy, edema, and tuberculosis. The mechanism was simple. Vitamin C, stored foods, canned goods, dried grains, salted meat, contain almost no ascorbic acid. The human body can't synthesize it. Without intake, tissue integrity begins to fail. The German medical journal Deutsche Medizinische Wochenschrift reported 35,000 scurvy cases during the blockade. Most occurred in cities. Rural households with winter gardens showed baseline levels. Dr. Unrein's conclusion: cold season vegetables are not supplemental, they are foundational. The British blockade continued until June 1919. By then, over 400,000 German civilians had died from malnutrition-related causes. The ones who survived often had January gardens. Fast forward. Leningrad, winter 1941 to 1942. The Wehrmacht encircles the city in September. Supply lines are cut. By January, rations drop to 125 grams of bread per day, about 450 calories. The temperature averages -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 600,000 people die between November and February. But inside the siege ring, Soviet agronomists at the Vavilov Institute implement emergency urban gardening programs. They distribute seeds, not for spring, but for immediate planting. The crops, winter cress, winter purslane, and a cold-hardy spinach variety, Spinacia tetrandra, developed in the 1930s for Arctic research stations. These seeds are planted in February, in bombed-out lots, in frozen soil mixed with rubble. Survival rate, low. But the ones that germinate produce harvestable greens by late March. The Leningrad Agricultural Committee recorded 12,000 urban plots under cultivation by April 1942. Total yield: estimate 3,500 tons of fresh vegetables. That's roughly 7 million pounds. Distributed across a population of 700,000, it's negligible on a calorie basis. Maybe 50 calories per person per day. But it provided vitamin C, iron, folate. Post-war Soviet medical records show that neighborhoods with active garden plots had lower mortality from dystrophy, starvation-related organ failure, compared to areas without gardens, even when total caloric intake was identical. The difference wasn't quantity, it was nutrition density. Winter gardens didn't prevent the famine. They blunted its lethality. By 1950, the system was disappearing. Not because it stopped working, because it didn't scale. The post-war agricultural model, developed in the US and exported globally through the Marshall Plan and later the Green Revolution, prioritized three things: mechanization, large-scale equipment, tractors, combines, center pivot irrigation, monoculture, single crops over hundreds of acres, optimized for machine harvest, year-round logistics, refrigerated transport enabling California lettuce in January instead of local mash. Winter succession planting didn't fit this model. First problem: labor intensity. Overwinter crops require hand seeding, selective harvesting, and continuous replanting. A 400 square foot plot might take 2 hours per week. Mechanized lettuce farming in the Salinas Valley produces 40,000 pounds per acre with 6 hours of human labor, total. Second problem: timing. Supermarkets need predictable supply. Winter crops mature variably depending on weather. Claytonia might be ready in 60 days or 90, depending on January temperatures. Industrial agriculture solves this by growing in climate-controlled regions and shipping. Third problem, profit margins. A packet of mash seeds costs $3, grows 50 plants, and produces 5 to 10 pounds of greens. Those greens don't store. They don't ship well. They're regionally specific. Compare that to iceberg lettuce, bred for durability, uniform size, and refrigerated shelf life of 21 days. Iceberg can be grown in Arizona, trucked to Chicago, and sold for $2 per head with consistent margins. Mash can't compete on price. It competes on resilience. But resilience isn't a market feature when the market doesn't fail. By the 1970s, agricultural extension services stopped teaching overwinter succession. The USDA Cooperative Extension, once the primary source of regional planting knowledge, shifted focus to high-yield varieties, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticide management. Publications from the 1940s that mentioned winter gardening were archived, not updated. It wasn't censorship. It was obsolescence by economic logic. Then something else happened. Seed companies consolidated. By 2020, 4 corporations, Bayer, Monsanto, Corteva, ChemChina, Syngenta, and BASF, controlled 60% of global seed sales. Their catalogs prioritized hybrids and patented varieties optimized for industrial conditions. Cold-hardy heirlooms, like Valerianella locusta Verta de Cambrai or Claytonia perfoliata miner's lettuce, remained available, but only through small specialty seed companies. Most gardeners never saw them. The system didn't collapse. It was quietly replaced by one that required continuous external inputs: fuel, fertilizer, refrigeration. As long as those inputs stayed cheap, the new system looked superior. But superior under what conditions? In 2003, researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks published a study in Hort Science titled Winter Production of Salad Greens in High Tunnels. The goal? Determine whether fresh vegetables could be grown through Arctic winter without supplemental heat. They tested 12 crops, including mash, claytonia, spinach, and landcress, in unheated hoop houses at 64 degrees north latitude, roughly the latitude of Reykjavik. Outdoor temperatures range from minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit between November and March. Results: mash, Valerianella locusta, germinated at soil temp of 35 degrees Fahrenheit, harvested continuously from January through April. Yield: 0.8 pounds per square foot. Winter purslane, Claytonia perfoliata, survived air temps down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Vitamin C content: 25 milligrams per 100 grams, equivalent to oranges. Spinach, cold hardy varieties, produced through February. Iron content increased 40% compared to summer-grown spinach, likely due to slower growth and nutrient concentration. The study's conclusion? These crops represent a viable strategy for food security in extreme climates, particularly where energy costs prohibit heated greenhouse production. No artificial heat, no grow lights, just plastic sheeting and plant biology. In 2012, Elliot Coleman, a farmer in Maine and author of the Winter Harvest Handbook, documented continuous winter harvests using mobile greenhouses, unheated, at 44 degrees north latitude. His farm, Four Season Farm, produces fresh greens year-round using the same crops described in 19th century European manuals. Coleman's innovation wasn't the plants, it was proving the system still worked under modern conditions. He recorded yields: 400 square feet, a 20 by 20 plot. Produced 200 pounds of mixed greens, mash, claytonia, arugula, spinach, between December and March. Economic value: at $8 per pound for salad mix, farmers' market prices, that's $1,600 gross revenue from a space the size of a bedroom. But more importantly, Those 200 pounds provided roughly 60,000 calories and critical micronutrients for a family of 4 across the 3 hungriest months. Coleman's work caught attention. By 2015, USDA Extension Services in Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire began republishing winter gardening guides, the first updates since the 1940s. The biological mechanisms are now well documented. Cold-induced sugars. When temperatures drop, plants like kale and spinach convert starches to sugars as an antifreeze response. This is why winter-harvested greens taste sweeter. It's not subjective. Brix levels, sugar content, increase 20 to 30% after frost exposure. Nutrient density. A 2017 study in Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found that winter-grown spinach contained 50% more vitamin C and 35% more antioxidants than summer-grown spinach. The researchers attributed this to slower growth, which allows more time for nutrient uptake and less water dilution. Carbon efficiency. Cold weather plants use C3 photosynthesis, which is more efficient than C4 used by warm season crops like corn at low light and low temperatures. This allows net energy gain even during short January days. The science isn't discovering something new. It's confirming what those Irish families already knew in 1847. We're now operating in a different resource context than the one that made winter gardens obsolete. In 2023, global diesel prices reached an average of $4.50 per gallon, up from $2.20 in 2020. Fertilizer costs remain 60% above pre-2020 levels. The FAO Food Price Index shows staple crop prices elevated despite stable harvests, driven primarily by energy and input costs. Translation. The cost of the centralized system is rising structurally, not cyclically. At the same time, climate instability is increasing yield variance. The 2021 Texas freeze destroyed $600 million in crops. The 2022 European drought cut vegetable production 25% in France and Italy. These aren't apocalypses, they're disruptions. But they compound. A household dependent on supermarket lettuce in January is vulnerable to fuel price shocks, transport disruptions, regional crop failures, import restrictions. A household growing mash, claytonia, and winter spinach in a backyard plot is not. This isn't about self-sufficiency in the survivalist sense, it's about reducing single points of failure. Here's what those 17 crops offer. Leafy greens, cold hardy, mash, Valerianella locusta, Claytonia/winter purslane, Claytonia perfoliata, landcress, Barberia verna, corn salad, Valerianella locusta, regional variant, spinach, cold hardy varieties, Bloomsdale winter giant, kale, Brassica oleracea var, Acaphala winterbore lacinato, chard, winter varieties, alliums, garlic, planted for scapes, bunching onions, Allium fistulosum, scallions, overwintered sets, leeks, overwintered harvested through February, brassicas, root/stem, rutabaga, overwintered, sweetens after frost, turnips, winter varieties, legumes, broad beans/fava beans, vicia faba, roots, parsnips, overwintered, harvested, January to March, carrots, overwintered under mulch, rhubarb, forced indoors for early stalks. Each of these crops germinates or survives in cold soil, tolerates frost, produces harvestable food between January and April, provides either calories, protein, or critical micronutrients. Together, they form a system. The endurance principle is simple. Optimization assumes stable conditions. Resilience assumes conditions will change. For 70 years, we optimized food systems for cost, speed, and convenience. Those systems work brilliantly until fuel costs spike, or a freeze hits, or logistics stall. Winter gardens don't replace supermarkets. They buffer against the times supermarkets fail. And they do it using knowledge that's older than mechanized agriculture, older than synthetic fertilizer, older than refrigerated transport. If remembering what was forgotten matters to you, subscribe to Roots of Survival. Every share helps keep this knowledge alive. In January 1847, those 7 families in County Cork didn't survive by accident. They survived because someone, generations earlier, noticed which plants kept growing when everything else died. That knowledge didn't require technology, it required attention. And it still works. This was never lost. It was set aside. And what was set aside can be remembered.